Hi, fourth graders. Here I am out in Skull Valley with our expedition. This is lesson 5, and it's the last one I'm doing on this subject. I'm calling it the Revolution. Before I get started, I want to tell you how much I regret, even though I love being out here in Skull Valley, how much I regret being able to be in the classroom with you during this expedition, because I really would have loved to hear your input. I know that when I was in school, like 45, 50 years ago, they kind of glossed over this part of history when they were teaching it, and I'm wondering what you've been taught in the past and if these lessons that I'm giving you gel with that or if they're different. Anyway, we'll talk about it hopefully someday, but for now we're staying safe. Moving on, we know that the English crossed the North Atlantic Ocean for many reasons. Some were explorers called to the New World by a curiosity and a sense of adventure. Others were seeking fame and fortune, and religious freedom also was a big motivator. The Catholic Church and the more strict Protestant Church were having this fierce competition back in England over which would be the official Church of England. Some who thought the Protestant Church didn't even go far enough in its strictness split off and became known as Puritans. The Puritans were not super popular in England, and going to the New World gave them this opportunity not only to practice their religion in peace, but also to try to pass their religion on to the Native Americans that were living in North America. When England approved the first Colonial Charter, it made private land ownership in North America possible. I talked before about how the Native Americans didn't really understand this idea of land ownership, but English law and these new charters gave settlers property rights and made the land theirs to keep and to pass on to their children. There were several more efforts at colonization this way, granting Maryland to Lord Baltimore, New York to the Duke of York, and Pennsylvania to William Penn, giving these men powers to govern and distribute land within the new territories. However, there was so much land within these colonies, it made it easy for settlers to create local assemblies to represent themselves, and there was a shift towards self-governance. As we know, the first exports from the colonies weren't worth very much, so at the time, England was fine with the colonies managing things all on their own. In the beginning, the colonies traded goods, but as settlers grew and the settlements grew over 170 years or so until the Revolution, the American economy became more complex, which led them to come up with a new system of money, or monetary system. The colonists introduced the widespread of paper money within the colonies. Specie, gold and silver coins, were the basis of the old system, but the colonies didn't produce gold or silver, and they weren't allowed to make their own coins. So the only way colonists could get specie was to sell or export goods for it. Exports to England allowed colonists to earn, but these earnings were used to pay for what they were buying from England, such as manufactured goods and weapons. Specie wasn't widely available to use within the colonies. Without it, the colonists had to rely on this barter or trading system, and they just outgrew it. In 1690, Massachusetts issued paper bills to pay wages to the soldiers who had fought the French, making the bills legal tender in the payment of colonial taxes, meaning the law said they could use it instead of coins or English money. The new paper system was a success, and it began to be used by the other colonies, mostly in connection with large military expenditures or spending. But merchants started to worry about this new currency's value and wanted colonists to pay their debts in English money, not colonial notes or the paper money that the colonies printed. In 1751, the English Parliament began restricting and prohibiting using this new system system of colonial notes. The colonies didn't like this rule. At least the colonists didn't, the merchants did. And many colonies, including New York and Pennsylvania, continued to make colonial notes, eventually gaining the right to use them as legal tender. England just kind of gave up on that one. For the most part, things went pretty smoothly between the North American colonies and England's king and parliament, which is England's legislative branch of government. But, always a but, right? As I pointed out last lesson, the British fought the French and Spanish for control over the continent in the French and Indian War. That's what they called it, the French and Indian War. In 1754, this was around 1754, and it ended in 1763. And as they were fighting and all this started happening, the first thoughts of independence began. After the war, the British colonists were no longer blocked to the west of the Mississippi River by the French. Still, England wanted them to stay near the East Coast, well, where things were a little bit easier to manage from England. Colonists began to wonder if they really needed the English anymore after all. They had fought alongside British military during that war, and they felt that the English had acted superior, like they were better than them. And as the population and prosperity of the colonies increased, that same rebellious nature the original settlers had still lived on in the present colonists' spirit. England stopped being so easygoing and began to crack down on smuggling, which is the illegal movement of goods into and out of the colonies. They wanted to regulate what kind of money was used and collect import taxes. American merchants protested against English officials searching their homes and warehouses for the stuff they might be smuggling. One of the lawyers in Boston at the time, James Otis Jr., wrote, "Taxation without representation was tyranny. Tyranny means cruel and oppressive government or rule." The English had spent a lot of money to win the French and Indian War. They argued that the war was fought for the colonists' benefit, so it was time that the colonists started paying their fair share of taxes. But the colonists didn't agree about the war being for their benefit. They thought it mostly benefited England. Also, the amount of tax to pay was hard to measure because the amounts varied among the colonies. Regardless, some colonists didn't think they should pay any taxes at all if no one represented them in England. Many Americans saw things trending in the wrong direction, away from the easygoing ways of the past. Others saw no major problem. They were pretty easygoing and felt like, there's no problem, we're English subjects, what's the big deal? And others were like, I don't care, one way or another, whatever. So, truth be told, colonists mainly only paid import taxes anyway, all the while benefiting from the protection of the world's largest navy and enjoying significant political freedom and self-government. Political representation wouldn't have helped the colonists much, considering how small their population was at the time. Parliament could have just called their no taxation without representation bluff and given them a small number of seats in the House of Commons. They didn't want to, though, and colonists from England felt they were already paying taxes, so a second layer of taxes was something that they thought their king should protect them against. The first major English tax after the French and Indian War was the Sugar Act of 1764. It didn't cause much of a ruckus because the colonists had already found a way around molasses taxes, and they just basically kept on smuggling and cheating so they didn't have to pay the taxes. The Stamp Act of 1765, though, was a game changer because there was no way to smuggle around it. Many historians use it to date the beginning of the American Revolution. The Stamp Act created a series of annoying everyday taxes, like on marriage licenses, deeds, wills, contracts, etc. It was the first time England required an everyday tax within the colonies. The response was vigorous and rowdy, with English tax collectors being tarred and feathered. They were caught, covered in this really sticky tar, and rolled in feathers. Rebels protested in many ways, making signs, writing songs, and marching in parades. A Congress met in New York to submit their complaints to King George III and the English Parliament, and the Stamp Act was repealed, meaning they changed their minds and canceled it. The colonists thought that their resistance was the reason that the Stamp Act was repealed, when really there was a lot of stuff going on at the time. There were many reasons, including a change in leadership back in England and problems with the young King George. King George III, he was very young, and unfortunately he was in the early stages of mental illness. He reportedly shook hands with an oak branch, thinking he'd met the King of Prussia, and he claimed that he couldn't see himself in mirrors. Parliament took back the Stamp Act, but immediately issued 2 new laws, sending military representatives to the colonies and reaffirming their right to tax. It was as if Parliament said, "You got your way this time, but don't forget, we can tax you whenever we want, and by the way, here are some troops to remind you in case you forget." Another tax, the Townshend duties of 1767, threw fuel on the fire, especially since part of the tax went to pay the troops who were there to collect the tax in the first place. The law also taxed imports, including paper, paint, glass, and tea. Resistors boycotted or stopped buying these goods, which freaked out English merchants and manufacturers who were trying to sell this stuff. They pushed Parliament to get rid of all the taxes, and they did, except for one, on tea. Rebels could see this clear pattern that resistance got results. Rebels continued to meet in taverns, and disagreements between colonists and England sometimes led to riots and bloodshed. Most of these disputes were related to religious freedom and England's crackdown on smuggling. Tea was a big deal back then. It was as popular as coffee is today, and colonists couldn't grow their own tea. In 1773, English Parliament gave a big boost to the British East India Company, making them the only importer of tea to the Americas. The Tea Act lowered the price of tea below the going rate, underselling the smugglers. Helping British East India Company was important because powerful rich people in England would lose all their money if it were to go out of business. The lowering of tea prices seemed like a good idea to most people, but some didn't like it because it hurt the smugglers. Smuggling tea was a time-honored right Americans wanted to hold on to, even if it meant it raised the prices. They'd kind of gotten used to this smuggling. It was part of the way they did business. Protesters organized a boycott throughout the colonies, meaning they refused to buy tea. Most of the big harbors, the places where the ships sailed in and out of, either turned away boats delivering tea, or they stored the tea in warehouses to sell later. However, in Boston, the governor ordered the tea to be taken off 3 ships and sold immediately. Sam Adams led rebels disguised as Native Americans onto these small ships and dumped 45 tons of tea off the vessels and into the mud. It was low tide. The destruction of the tea, or Tea Riot as it was known then, ruined over $1 million worth of tea by today's standards. And the Boston Tea Party, as it's known now, made England extremely angry. They demanded to be paid back for the tea, and they overreacted by closing Boston's harbor and taking apart their locally elected government. England tried to teach the colonists a lessons by punishing Boston, but their strategy backfired. Not only did the the Americans side with the colonists in Boston, but it kind of rallied more Americans to the rebels' cause. Colonial representatives met under one roof for the first time in Philadelphia, and small-scale sporadic fighting broke out across New England as rebels stole British ammunition and weapons stockpiles. In April 1775, Minutemen, who were trained to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, gathered near Boston, practicing and drilling in preparation for a possible fight with the English military. The English military were sent to keep the Minutemen from drilling outside Boston, and this led to a fight. A warning system alerted the Minutemen to be ready. No one really knows who made the first shot, but it became known as the shot heard round the world, beginning the Revolutionary War. Later, George Washington was sent to join the rebels into an army, which he called the Troops of the United Provinces of North America. Historians now suspect that the name gradually changed into the United States of America. On Christmas Day in 1775, George Washington wrote about the United Colonies, and about a week later, Washington's aide used the term United States of America in a letter that he wrote. The United States of America is an interesting name, regardless of who came up with it. The name describes a concept. The idea of a nation sharing power with existing states underneath was in the country's name before the founders actually even designed it or even declared their independence. I find that interesting. But that's the end of this expedition. The Revolutionary War and Declaration of Independence is an expedition all its own. Thank you for taking time to learn how Europeans explored and colonized and eventually decided to make the country their own here in North America. As always, I love you and I wish you well.